Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. We have had two national elections now in which the Democratic Party, the allegedly liberal party, has lost ground. 4 years ago, they lost the presidency, and this year, while gaining back the White House, they lost seats in the House of Representatives, did not regain control of the Senate, and were unable to increase their control of state legislatures. And it's those state legislatures that will determine reapportionment based on the results of the 2020 census. These losses came despite 4 years of Trump's incompetence, including a so-called stimulus bill that shifted an enormous amount of wealth to the already wealthy elite. There are several reasons for this, including an uninspiring presidential candidate who barely campaigned at all, and with few exceptions, candidates who wanted to return to the policies of the Obama years that drove millions of working people to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. But one of the few factors that people want to talk about is identity politics. Wikipedia defines identity politics as a term that describes a political approach wherein people of a particular religion, race, social background, class, or other identifying factor develop political agendas and organize based upon the interlocking systems of oppression that affect their lives and come from their various identities. In this program, you'll hear many different voices discussing the impact of identity politics on the American electoral scene and in particular on the left. Let me say at the outset that I fully support the effort to remove discrimination of every kind against all those groups that experience it. But what I want to focus on is the strategy of identity politics and the results that strategy has had on the left in the United States and on our politics in general. I want to begin with Diana Johnstone. Johnstone was active in the struggle against the Vietnam War in the 60s, and from 1979 to 1990, she was the European editor of the U.S. weekly In These Times. And she's written many books, most recently, Circle in the Darkness, Memoirs of a World Watcher. I heartily recommend that book, by the way. The following is from an interview she did recently with Chris Hedges for his RT program On Contact. Hedges begins by asking Johnstone, now 86 years old, about the state of the left following World War II.
At the end of World War II, of course, the left was very powerful, were very strong worldwide because fascism had been defeated and so on. The U.S. leaders simply found that it was too advantageous and profitable to have an enemy. And I look at it now that they really created the Cold War to keep an enemy which allowed the military-industrial complex to grow in order to have a military Keynesianism rather than social welfare. And because communism became the enemy, the whole left was on the defensive. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And then guilt by association was used for the entire left. And the liberals worked to dissociate themselves from this new enemy that had been discovered and became then the advocates of the Cold War. Partly starting off, I would say, in self-defense, because there were a lot of liberals left over from the New Deal. It was a political self-defense to join the new crusade against the new enemy. At home, this put the left on the defensive, and abroad, it made it impossible to really understand what was going on in the world. I think this is very important because the official doctrine was that the United States is freedom against this communist monster that is trying to take over the world, which was not true, actually. Every progressive movement in the world was misinterpreted as some sort of Soviet move. And this made it impossible to understand and explain the Asian revolutions, the Asian independence movements, notably in China and later in Vietnam, so that the whole world picture was distorted, and the liberal media went along with this distortion.
The Cold War, as she points out, was the final blow that killed the U.S. left and led to the Vietnam War, which almost resurrected the left. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was necessary for the U.S. to invent a new enemy to justify the hundreds of billions of dollars spent every year on the military and the hundreds of U.S. military bases around the world. So the global war on terrorism was invented as the new enemy, and as we remember, virtually every member of the so-called Liberal Party voted to authorize this war, everyone but Barbara Lee of California. While there were huge demonstrations against the Iraq War, almost all politicians in D.C. supported that illegal war based on lies. As a result of the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberalism that began in the early 80s, the left also began to shift its focus away from working people and from economic issues towards social issues. Here's John Stone again.
Notably in France, because in France in 1981, there was a real, the common program of the left was elected with Mitterrand, and it was socialists and communists together. It was a real social democratic program, and it ran into demands of international capital in the form of the European Union. Mitterrand capitulates to international capitalism, if you will, and at that point, the left changes its values to what are called here the societal values. And Mitterrand's main accomplishment was about abolition of the death penalty. That's very nice, but it has nothing to do with the economic order of society. And then the socialists took up the cause of anti-racism. Well, I'm all for anti-racism, but the point is that the left then became a matter of attitudes rather than policies. It became a matter of enforcing good thoughts, good attitudes, be nice, rather than the policies that would bring people together. If certain minority groups are discriminated against, it's also because the economy is like that. And, a socialist, or for that matter, a Christian way of bringing people together, you overcome racism by bringing people together in a common cause. But this was just it was the opposite of that. It was telling people they should have good attitudes about other people. And you see where that leads. In fact, it leads to antagonism.
So let's dissect this a bit. John Stone is saying that concentrating on ethical attitudes towards certain groups of people leads to antagonism. How so? Well, we can see that easily today in our cancel culture. People who say, or said at some point in the past, something that is perceived as offensive to one group or another become pariahs. The left tries to ban them from campuses or government or the airwaves, and we can all think of examples. This antagonizes those who supported those figures and, as well, those who are not among the groups the left is advocating for. John Stone notes that this also has implications for our foreign policy.
The idea, if you have the idea that the most important thing is to defend minorities, then it's ideologically very easy for imperialism to say, "Oh, there's a minority in that country that we need to defend." So it becomes the pretext for overthrowing governments you don't like, that you are going to save some people from the disaster that hypothetically would befall them.
A good recent example of this, of course, is the effort to make people think that the reason we intervened and have to continue occupying Afghanistan is because of our great concern for the human rights of women. Over time, these attitudes also begin to infect our domestic relationships with one another. Listen to what John Stone has to say about Antifa.
You have been very critical of Antifa, as have I. But you really see groups like Antifa as the natural culmination of the disintegration of the left itself. Explain why.
There are many things wrong with them, but it has the psychological aspect of identity politics in this since group of people this identify themselves as anti-fascists. Nobody has given them that role. They identify themselves as we are essentially good, and the people we don't like are fascists or proto-fascists or would-be fascists, or they were leading to fascism, and they treat other people as if they were essentially that fascist, rather than treating other people as people who have a different point of view and we could discuss and define our differences, or perhaps find ways to deal with them. And it's very essentialist in that one group feels it has a vocation to eliminate another. They have been extremely harmful to movements everywhere. Most recently, they've been harmful to the Yellow Vest movement in France by going in groups to see who is not properly on the left and chase them out physically. At a time when you should be bringing people together against the tyranny of financial capital, which is determining everything, which has taken away our democracy, when you should be bringing ordinary people together to talk about how in the world do we get out of this situation? How do we restore democracy? How do we accomplish things? Instead, you have this group going around and say they're not pure enough, get out. And you see, it's absolutely catastrophic to my point of view. And of course, there's no thought there at all. It's just, there's no analysis. They don't have any positive program for anything. And that means that what they are in fact doing is they're acting as a thought police of the system, because they don't attack the real powers. They attack marginals, and the marginals might get together and be something. They attack people who do not have power, and simply they're the stormtroopers of the system.
Now, you may well disagree with Johnstone and Hedges on this point, but isn't it true that Antifa uses violence to silence or attempt to silence voices with which it disagrees? In many cases, the anti-fascists and those they consider fascists are both members of the working class who are being oppressed by the forces of finance capital. If we reject everyone with whom we disagree, especially when that rejection is violent, how will we ever come together against our common enemy? A more likely outcome is an increase in the hatred of each side for the other. Here's another perspective from Mark Lilla, professor of humanities at Columbia University.
Taking the American case in the 1930s through the 1970s, there was a sense on the American left that what bound us together was the fact that we were citizens with a common destiny, with a few basic shared values of solidarity and equal protection under the law. And this kind of American liberalism was capable of attracting people in every part of the country. But as time went on, a different kind of identity politics grew up, more in tune with the individualism of our neoliberal age. Beginning in the 1990s, a new kind of identity politics based not so much on shared political program, but on individual personal identity and how one saw oneself. So questions of gender identity and racial identity and so on became not so much political questions as interior psychological ones. The debate shifted from how to achieve justice outside in the world through politics to how to receive recognition within society. And so a kind of cultural politics grew up on the left that focused on universities, on the media, on Hollywood, and on changing Americans' minds and intuitions about social acceptance, which in most respects was a very good thing. But when that turn within happened, American liberals turned away from the project of creating larger coalitions, stating a larger goal, and setting out a vision for the entire country. The American left response was always to respond to and accentuate our differences among people rather than on what we shared, to the extent that the very word "we" fell into question. Well, this kind of cultural politics withdrew a lot of energy, this cultural politics, from electoral politics, and created an opportunity for a very radical right in America to begin taking over our political institutions. And liberals and the left have not been able to mount a serious challenge to that because it would require going to states where people are religious, overwhelmingly white, rather traditional in their views about men and women and family, and convincing them that you have a common goal and a common interest. But mainly the parties have just gone to defeat because they've been unable to express what it is we share together. And in particular, have not been able to address themselves to a shared citizenship and the question of who is and who is not citizens. And that means the question of immigration. So the question of personal identity in the United States is like the problem of immigration in Europe. These are the roadblocks that prevent the left today from recapturing the attention of their publics at large and seizing power back from the radical right in our time.
Professor Lilla points out that when the economic message and the working class are abandoned by the left, right-wing populists will inevitably try to win over those working class voters. And one of their best weapons is the message that the only thing the left is concerned about is minorities, gays, and an open borders approach to immigration. They can also point to the obvious disdain the left appears to have for traditional Christianity, the importance of family, and the flyover states in general. These are potent messages, admittedly tinged with racism, but they are appealing to voters who feel abandoned by the left. Here's 2020 presidential candidate Andrew Yang discussing identity politics with Dave Rubin on the Rubin Report. We start with Rubin's opening question.
Identity politics, which seemingly has become the cultural issue, and I think almost every one of the policy issues is now rooted in identity politics. So I think you can argue that the way we talk about free college is somehow rooted in identity politics. Certainly immigration is rooted in identity politics. That we're sadly whittling everyone down to, you're an Asian man and I must have some judgment on you because of that, and this person's white and this person's black and this person's Muslim, et cetera, et cetera. Do you view identity, I've heard you talk about it a little bit actually, but do you view identity politics as positive, as dangerous, as a tool for something?
It's like a lot of the other things we've been talking about. It's like I understand the sentiment and ideas around identity politics. I don't think it's a great way to try and build consensus or bring people together or get big policies across the finish line. And I think it's a kind of stupid way to try and win elections. And so I think the Democratic Party needs to try and gravitate away from identity politics and towards things that would actually bridge the gap. So that's one of my missions during this campaign, is to make that case, to say, look, I understand people have different experiences. I've had different experiences. But if we're going to solve some of these problems, we have to emphasize the things that will bring us together and not the things that are going to make us seem like we're living different lives.
So that must be pretty sad for you to see how far the Democratic Party has gone in on this, or at least some of the other candidates that you're going to be standing on stage with have gone with this.
Yeah, it's been really interesting for me because like I've been like a Democrat, and like I thought it's like, hey, it's like I'm just like you guys, like you know,
who cares? Nobody cares.
Yeah, and
but the odd thing is they I don't mean the people on stage necessarily, but the people that buy into these ideas would look at you and go, okay, well, he's Asian, and because of the way Asians are socioeconomically successful and families stay together and all these things, your markers of identity are the ones that get punished. I mean, obviously, I'm sure I don't have to tell you about what happened with Harvard and the Asian students that they wanted to deflate the numbers on, and it's like, no one gave your parents from Taiwan anything when they got here, but they want you to be punished because they worked hard and now you work hard.
Well, you know, it's like the Asian American identity. Certainly, it's got like its own distinct place in like the like the sort of like identity hierarchy, I suppose.
Well, I would say a very precarious place, unfortunately.
But like the case I'm making is like, look, my parents came here to have a better life for me and my brother, and it's worked. And now I'm trying to give back, and that's been my experience as an American. I'm a very proud American, and I want to try and make this country stronger so that my kids and other people's kids grow up in a country that we're all still excited about. And we do not have that much time to make that happen because things are coming apart very quickly.
Well, you can hear in Rubin's comments and questions the negative perceptions of identity politics by those on the right and the ease with which they can forge an effective counterargument. But perhaps the most potent example of the problem of identity politics in a national election is Hillary Clinton. Listen to this excerpt from a stump speech she gave in 2016.
If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? No. Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight? No. Would that solve our problem with voting rights and Republicans who are trying to strip them away from people of color, the elderly, and the young? No.
Inadvertently, Clinton gives us a real insight into the reason why identity politics remains so attractive to the Democratic Party leadership. It doesn't threaten financial capital. We don't need to break up the big banks or the internet monopolies because that won't eliminate racism. We don't need to cut the military budget or provide health care for all because that won't eliminate sexism. We don't need to offend our donors on Wall Street by addressing any of the gross economic inequalities that plague the nation. We can just rail against racism, sexism, and gender discrimination, none of which they care about one way or the other. The result of this focus can be seen in the Obama administration's economic record. Here's Derek Hamilton, the professor of economics at the New School, speaking on PBS.
I'd say it was a missed opportunity. He certainly faced a catastrophe when he came into office, but nothing fundamentally changed the trajectory towards inequality. If we characterize an economy as being in a catastrophe at unemployment rates greater than 8%, the black unemployment rate is still above 8%. So frankly, black Americans are still in a Great Depression or Great Recession at the very least. And then if we invoke the paramount indicator of economic security, wealth, then we know there's virtually no progress that's been made under the Barack Obama administration. Obama's economic legacy was on the table in this election. Trump put it on the table front and center, along with a lot of other things. And I think Obama actually campaigned to defend his economic legacy. We needed bolder, stronger, more fundamental, not tinkering ideas to really structurally change the U.S. economy.
Of course, those bold ideas that transcend tinkering are opposed by Wall Street and the billionaires who finance Democratic campaigns. It's more profitable for Democrats to take the money and talk about how they're so opposed to racism, sexism, and gender discrimination, and how those Republicans are all racist. That way they can continue to rake in the big bucks and the cushy think tank and corporate board jobs that they're promised when their political careers are over. But it doesn't need to be an either-or proposition. If we work to eliminate wealth and income inequality, provide health care as a human right, create jobs building green infrastructure and affordable housing, and forgive student debt, the real lives of people of all races, genders, and religious identities will be improved. The trick for politicians is to find ways to fund their campaigns without capitulating to the demands of the wealthy. The left also needs to remain committed to equality and equal rights for all, regardless of race, creed, or gender. But in striving for these goals, I believe we need to concentrate on strategies that do not cause division, but help us gain the broad base of support that's needed in order to gain political power to effect the changes we believe in. We must learn to listen to those who disagree with us, even those who are obviously racist. Much of the rhetoric of progressive Democrats over the last few years has belittled Trump voters. They have been called ignorant, deplorable, racist, and blind followers of right-wing Christian pastors. Their legitimate economic concerns are derided as coming from white privilege, and we're convinced that the real reason they voted for Trump was racism. And then we wonder why so many think that Democrats are elitist, holier than thou. These attitudes are amplified by the partisan media on both sides, while all of us, regardless of whether we are white or not, or whether we live on the coasts or in flyover country, are suffering from the financial precarity caused by the corporate-sponsored neoliberalism of both political parties. The sons and daughters of Americans of all races and genders are being killed and maimed in useless and endless wars to maintain the economic supremacy of U.S. business and banking. But we are finding new ways to fight among ourselves, while our only viable political parties serve our oppressors. That needs to stop. I don't have the answer or the magical power to bring the working class together, but I believe we have to listen to one another and respect each other before any progress can be made. Well, that's it for this week on Wider View. If you have comments about this program, please send me an email at widerviewradio@gmail.com or make a comment on our Facebook page, Wider View Radio. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. We aim to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives that you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. And one other note, if you are listening to Wider View on a community radio station, please consider supporting that community radio station financially. As we approach the end of the year, your financial contributions are going to help you on your income taxes. So this is the time to make a contribution if you possibly can. But until next week, this is your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening to Wider View.